or face in the middle. That's okay, isn't it? Yeah.
Brilliant. Welcome to this live stream. I'm delighted this morning to be speaking to Professor Keith Ward. Professor, it's a real pleasure and honor to see you.
God, thank you. It's good to be here.
So I've been following your work for many years, and one of the things that I wanted to begin off with is um, you write that when you were in, I think, King's College London, and you received a letter directly from Her Majesty's service for a new appointment in Oxford, and switching over from being a philosopher to a theologian, there was a different reception from your colleagues for when you were a professor to when you were a theologian. So maybe that's a nice segue into the book before we begin.
Yes, well, it's something about the state of philosophy in Britain that there are many good philosophers, but most of them have no interest in religion at all. They simply don't discuss it. A few of them, quite well-known ones, are atheists. So the expectation is that if you're a professor of philosophy, you're probably an atheist. So when I became a professor of what in Oxford is called divinity, which means religion or theology, to them that was a very strange, to some of them anyway, that was a very strange move to make.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the perception of being a philosopher also gives more credibility to one's arguments than one's a theologian. But if you're a theologian, you would also have more epistemic tools than a philosopher, because you'd not only look at, say, Western analytical philosophy or these abstract ideas, you'd also bring in ideas from the wisdoms of the ancients. You know, the way I see it is your pool of resources is widened. So if anything, you should be more respected than just being a philosopher.
Well, maybe that's true. What I have found is that philosophy in Britain now tends to be very ahistorical. It doesn't look at the history of ideas or how they've changed and why they've changed. Whereas in the theology, you're looking at the history of ideas. You're also looking at different languages, different linguistic ways of looking at the world. And you've got a more human contact, really. You're probably looking at people's actual religious experiences. And so it's more connected with how people actually live than philosophy tends to be, which is concerned very largely with abstract questions, really important ones, but not ones that people are very concerned with on the whole.
Absolutely. No, that's definitely a good way of answering that question. So, Professor, you wrote the book, Why There Almost Certainly Is a God, Doubting Dawkins. And this is obviously in response to Dawkins' The God Delusion.
Yes.
So the first thing I want to ask you is, what motivated you to write this book?
Richard Dawkins was a professor in Oxford when I got here, and he immediately criticized the fact that I had religious beliefs. He didn't think theology should even be taught in the university because he thought it was so irrational. So naturally, I found out to reply to that. And we had a number of public debates in Oxford, and in which we made public arguments. And so we became, I think, reasonably friendly. He's not a horrible man. He's very a likable person. But when he talks about religion, he gets very savage, really. And so the debates were very tough, very tough. But the thing about them was he's a very good zoologist. That's his subject, zoology and evolutionary zoology. And he's very good at that indeed. But it must be said, he knows nothing about philosophy or theology, nothing at all. And so there's strange debates. He was making scientific points with most of which I agreed. But when he actually came to talk about religion, he's really quite weak. But he was a good debater. He's a good speaker.
Yeah. Absolutely. And there's a question I asked Professor Michael Roose, because he's obviously had interactions with Dawkins, and I'll
Yeah.
ask you the same question. So, Michael Roose famously said that Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, made him embarrassed to be an atheist. And I asked Roose if your perspective is different to Dawkins, because Dawkins seems to be more tempted to scientism than you are in terms of his
Yeah.
epistemology. So
Yeah.
I'll put the same question to you, Professor Ward. Do you think the root problem of Dawkins' God delusion is essentially his scientism worldview?
Yes, absolutely. I think what Dawkins hates is those forms of religion which do attack science, and there are some. If people take a very, very literalistic view of the Bible or the Quran, they will then say, "Oh, the scientists are wrong about this, that, and the other," and so Dawkins attacks that position. When people like me, and indeed Michael Roose too, say, but that's not what reasonable religious believers think. He ignores that, and he goes for the very open, simplified views. That, for example, in the Christian case, which he knows most about, um, he attacks people who think the world was created in 6 24-hour periods of time just a few thousand years ago. And so when we say we actually believe that, there's in many interpretations of scriptural texts which are symbolic or metaphorical and very poetic, but they're not scientific statements. He ignores that. So he thinks, well, there's only science, there's nothing else. I mean, there's no philosophy. In
Yeah.
fact, he thinks philosophy is a waste of time as well as theology. So there you are.
Yeah.
What can you do?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's begin off with his idea that God is a scientific hypothesis that should be tested like
Yeah.
any other. So why would you, as a philosopher, and why do other philosophers critique that position?
Well, because scientific explanation, while it's very valuable, is only one sort of explanation. You have to have general laws of nature according to which things act regularly, like the law of gravity, for example. And then you have to have some way of putting these laws into mathematical, precise formulae. And that's good science. You get a mathematical formulation of the law of gravity. That's good science. But you can't do that when you're thinking about the ultimate nature of reality as a whole, because you'll have to ask the question, what's the nature of those laws? Why should it be that things act in regular ways? I mean, it's not obvious that they should, or that there would be laws of nature at all. And so ask that question. Then there are other questions, like the simple question, should I do what is good and what is meant by good? And is there such a thing as goodness in the universe? And of course, science doesn't deal with that question. It's a different sort of explanation. It's a philosophical explanation. You say, yeah, what is the nature of reality? Does consciousness exist, for example? And could it be reduced to brain movements of a physical sort? That's a philosophical question. It's not a scientific question. You've got to know about science to answer it, but you can't give the answer by coming up with some equation. I mean, it's not like that at all. So, in history, in morality, in art and music, in lots of ways, and even in personal relationships. There are lots of explanations, like, why am I doing this talk with you? Well, there's an answer to that question, but it's not a scientific one. I can't give you a formula, an equation, which is so it has to happen. So he just is wrong in thinking there's only one sort of explanation.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I really admire about the way Charles Darwin saw philosophy and theology is that he saw these as paradigms which are separate from science, but you could hold on to different belief systems within those paradigms. So, for example, his friend Asa Gray believed in his theory. He was actually a ardent supporter, and in response to his beliefs, Darwin said that he sees no problem in being an ardent evolutionist and a theist. Yet the premise of the God delusion is saying the opposite, that, well, if you believe in a scientific explanation, then you cannot believe in a divine explanation.
That's right. Asa Gray was, in fact, a Christian minister of a Christian church. So he wasn't just a believer, he actually preached about religion. Darwin himself was never an atheist. He did give up some common Christian beliefs in his day, but so do other Christians, so do other religious believers. But with regard to God, well, all his writings are on the internet, actually, but he said about these questions about God, I am in deep mud. That's what he said. But he did say, I've never been an atheist. And of course, Darwin himself was buried in Westminster Abbey with a sermon by a bishop. So he wasn't against religion at all.
Yeah. And what's also interesting about him is that his deism, so if anything, he could be described as a deist, was with him when he actually published The Origin of Species. So he didn't see a contradiction between a scientific explanation and a philosophical belief in some sort of higher being. But also what I found interesting is that he said, I never intended to write atheistically. I'm not sure if you've come across him saying that, but this is something you can find on the Darwin Correspondence Project. So he's actually being abundantly clear that his theory doesn't imply atheism.
That's true. I think he was personally very influenced by the death of his daughter, and that had a big emotional impact. So what was troubling for him was the amount of pain and suffering in the world. And, well, many of us have problems about that. It doesn't stop believing in God. It means that God is not as straightforwardly comprehensible as you might have thought, but it's still amazing that the scientific world obeys rational principles, and so you do have a problem. I mean, this is not unproblematic, believing in God, but as a philosopher, I think that everything is problematic. We don't really understand fully the world at all. And what he doesn't see is the science itself. Well, quantum physics actually so much overruled some of the things that Newton had said that Einstein himself couldn't believe it for a long time. Even though he was responsible for it, he still didn't believe it. So science has a long way to go yet.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what's interesting is the beauty of science is only possible if you have a moral imperative or drive to discern what is the universe like. And when we look at people in the past, like Hooke, like Newton, they were religious figures. They were people who believed in God deeply. They saw themselves as doing God's work. And even before them, we had the Muslims in the medieval period with the same type of feeling. So Dawkins' view that, religion somehow undermines science, well, history seems to give a different story.
It certainly does. I mean, again, Dawkins doesn't know much about the actual history of scientific discovery, but some of the greatest scientists, like Michael Faraday, he's one of the absolutely outstanding scientists. He was an elder, a leader in the Church of Scotland. And Einstein had a picture of Faraday in his room. So it's obvious that there are lots of people, and today there are very eminent scientists who are religious believers. So how could anybody say you must be stupid if you it's just incomprehensible.
Yeah, absolutely. And today, obviously, we have the likes of Francis Collins.
Yes,
Yeah. And what I also found interesting, correct me if I'm wrong, I read in one of your works that if we look at, say, something like common anatomy or genetics, we could give a explanation of a common designer, and that necessarily doesn't go against a scientific understanding. So I'm not saying you have to hold on to certain beliefs about common ancestry. What I'm saying is that it seems to be the case that evolution, or whatever aspects of it you want to accept or reject, can fit quite comfortably with different aspects of how God could have created life.
Yes, I'm sure that's true. You mentioned Francis Collins, and he was the head of a human genome project. So one of the greatest scientists in the study of genetics. And he wrote a book, as you know, of course, called The Language of God. And that was how DNA and the structure of DNA is the language of God for the nature of life. And people don't say he's stupid. So I'm not sure how Dawkins is with that at all.
Yeah. What I found interesting is that Francis Collins and Dawkins had a recent debate. I think it was last year. And during the debate, Dawkins was giving his argument for essentially the same argument as the God delusion, and Francis Collins said, "Well, me and you are in the same boat when it comes to a scientific explanation. The question is, where did all this come from? Going back to the laws of nature." And I think this point has been made several times, but it just seems to be the case that new atheists don't go that far. They just want to stick to the surface level arguments rather than getting to the metaphysics.
Yes, I think that's true. I'm very interested in quantum physics, and I talk in Oxford to a lot of quantum physicists. And on the whole, what they say is, well, religion isn't our job. And in fact, in quantum physics, we can do the maths, we can make the predictions, we can produce mobile phones and computers, but we don't know how the whole thing is working. We've got no idea. If you ask the question in quantum physics, what is the world really like? We don't know. So that they tend to say, just do the maths. Don't ask the question. It's not our business. But people like Francis Collins, of course, and John Polkinghorne, and many more too, say, well, you've got to ask those questions. What is the nature of reality, and why is it so mathematically structured? Why is it so? It looks as though any reasonable person would say it's a vast intelligence of mathematical beauty that has constructed this universe. Perhaps we don't worship it. Perhaps we don't go to a church or a synagogue or anything like that. But it is more than we can understand, and it is moreover rational. It's not just random. It's just as though anything might happen. There are beautiful, elegant, mathematically structured laws. And that's just amazing. So I find that quantum physicists, even though they're not all religious by any means, they all take the idea of a cosmic intelligence seriously. And I talk to groups of physicists, they ask you sometimes, just to know what a theologian might think. And they all say, well, actually, that's possible, which is quite something these days.
Absolutely. Now, in your book, you address in a very comprehensive and powerful way the simple ways we can respond to the God delusion and the arguments of the new atheists. Now, one of the points I wanted you to elaborate on is Dawkins' idea always boils down to we must look for simple explanations. And one of the things that I saw in a discussion between himself and Alistair McGrath was when Dawkins was giving the example, well, we have to have a simple explanation, just like a Darwinian explanation. We cannot, refer to something else more complex. I wanted to give you something I was thinking about, because this has been responded to in many, many different ways, but this is just something I was thinking about, that when it comes to the idea that everything is made of indivisible atoms, which is what was believed previously, that's far more simple than quantum mechanics and all the different Copenhagen and informational and relational and all these different many worlds theories and interpretations. So we should say, well, that shouldn't have happened. Quantum mechanics shouldn't have actually been the correct answer, as opposed to the indivisible atom. So the Occam's razor explanation has been taken as a brute fact of the way that we should reason. But we should be challenging that based upon what we've found in science, right?
Yeah. Well, again, this goes back to probability theory. That is what Dawkins thinks the simple is always more probable than the complex. That's an axiom of his. And he's totally wrong. I mean, this is just opposed to all probability theory. And let me explain very briefly how. If you ask what makes something probable as opposed to improbable, you've got to have some background information which will help you to decide what's probable. So you look around at life and say, is it probable that I will be knocked over by a car this morning? Well, I hope it's not probable. I mean, it's possible, but it's very improbable. But how do I decide that? Well, I'll look at the statistics of how many people get killed by cars. I've got all that background information, 1 in 1,000 perhaps of chance. But, it's much less than that. But with the universe, you say, is the universe probable? Dawkins would say, no, because the simple is more probable than the complex. The universe is very complex, so there can't be a God who's also very complex. God would need explaining because God is improbable. He's just wrong. He's just mathematically wrong because there's no background information to the universe. I mean, you call the universe, but you don't have any other universe to test whether it's probable or not. So the concluding bottom line is, if there was nothing at all, and you said, is a complex universe less probable than a simple one, or no God, in other words, the answer is no. The opposite is true, because if you make a list of every possible state of affairs there could ever be, then there are hugely more complex states of affairs than simple ones. Obviously, that's obvious. So if there are hugely more complex states of affairs, if there is any probability at all, it's more probable that one of them will be there, not the simple one. So that's a simple mathematical truth. Without any background information, the more complex is more probable than the simple, of which is only one case. So he just got his probability theory wrong, which for a zoologist is a pity.
That's a really good way of putting it. But it's interesting because even though he is obviously a very good writer, this is something that his opponents have to give him credit for. When it comes to some basic points, he seems to miss the mark, but also miss the fact that many people have responded to things that he says, and he says them as if he discovered some truth. So one of the things I think one of the philosophers said about him is he goes around saying who made God as if he made some profound discovery. I'm not sure if it was you or someone else who said this, but this has been addressed many times and it's had very good answers. So I wanted to put a answer to you that I heard between Lennox and Professor Lennox and Dawkins when they had a debate, and the answer that Lennox was giving is, well, everything has to go back to something. You can't just go back forever. So it's either going to be the universe always existed or God always existed. And Dawkins' basic response to that, well, is better to believe in the universe, right? But the point I want you to put to you is, hasn't he in a way conceded that even asking who made God is a superfluous question, because whatever you believe in, you'll ultimately have to go back to a first cause either way?
Yes. John Lennox, who you mentioned, was professor of mathematics in Oxford, actually, so he knows what probability theory is. What Dawkins won't allow is that there might be, it's possible, let's leave it to the realm of possibility, it's possible that there is a reality which is not capable of changing or coming into being or being destroyed. Philosophers call it a necessary being. It just has to be the way it is. Now, we don't know why, but it's possible that there is such a being. So a contingent being might come into existence, and one of the traditional arguments for God is that everything that is capable of coming into existence must have been caused by something else. So Dawkins says, well, so God must have been caused by something else. But the point is, if God is a necessary existence, if God is such that God has to exist, could not come into being or being destroyed, then God couldn't have a cause. I mean, there are some things, God's not the only one. The truths of mathematics, take that one. 2 + 2 = 4. It's always equal 4. You would say, well, what caused that? Well, nothing caused that. It's just a necessary truth. It has to be true. Why? Well, I don't know why, but 2 + 2 can't equal 5. And so you can say, well, God is a necessary. That's a possibility. So when Dawkins says that's impossible, it would all be better without God. Something must have caused God. The simple answer is, don't you think there's a possibility of a being which is not capable of being brought about because it's not in time? And of course, that's what all believers of God have always said.
Yes.
So why can't Dawkins admit that as a possibility, at least? Well, there you are.
Well, some would say that he did actually acknowledge it as a possibility in that debate, because when Lennox put it to him, whether it's the universe or God, we have to accept one ultimately. He had no answer to that, because he's realized like you said, you have to go back to some necessary being, whether the necessary being is the universe or not. And previously to this, Professor Ward, atheists like Russell, he would say the universe is just a brute fact.
Yeah.
So, if someone was to say to Bertrand Russell that, well, what caused the universe, he would say, well, the universe is a necessary being. It's always been there. So that is the God from that perspective, right? From their perspective.
Yeah.
Yet they don't grant the same charity to the theist who wants to say, well, God's always been there.
No. And there's one big word we haven't mentioned this morning, which is absolutely vital, and that's the word consciousness. And the fact is, the universe certainly contains conscious beings. We are conscious beings, and we do things. We explain our actions by giving reasons. We don't give scientific laws. We give a reason. I do this because I like it, or because it's good, or I've got a reason for what I do. It's not just a brute fact. And so when you bring consciousness into the universe, scientists don't know how to cope with it. They really don't. I mean, it's just a problem that science can't cope with. We know the way we are conscious depends on the brain, but consciousness is not the brain. It is what we are aware of. And you could say, well, science will have to one day admit that consciousness is not scientifically explicable. You can explain how the brain channels or expresses or even gives rise to, in a sense, consciousness, but consciousness is still something that is part of reality. Now, the point is, when you say God or the universe, you are saying a universe without consciousness or a consciousness which produces the universe. I would think if you put those alternatives, then God is the more reasonable explanation, because a consciousness that produced the universe is a better explanation for why the universe exists than just saying, oh, it's just there for no reason at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And on the topic of consciousness, I recently interviewed Stephen Law, and his view was that consciousness is a conceptual, philosophical issue. It's not something that can be solved scientifically. Would you concur with that?
Yes, I agree with that. Stephen Law is a friend of mine. He used to smile very well. He's certainly not a believer in God, but on that one issue, he's right.
Yes. And I recently hosted a discussion between Stephen Law and Michael Roose. And Roose has been, in recent years, flirting, I guess, or subscribing maybe a bit strong, but definitely messing around with the idea that perhaps consciousness was there from the beginning, right? So what are your thoughts on this? Because I'm now starting to see more and more philosophers warm up to the idea of panpsychism.
That's true. Panpsychism being the conscious, everything is conscious to some degree, basically. Well, if you look at the history of philosophy, I stick to Western European philosophy, but I could go elsewhere. But sticking to European philosophy, most philosophers, the vast majority, have thought that consciousness is more obviously existent and is probably prior to matter, or the brain, or whatever. Certainly, Plato and Aristotle, going back to the origins of European thought, took that for granted, and that the ultimate reality wasn't physical at all, and that the physical universe is some sort of appearance or expression of a mental a conscious reality. And the traditional British philosophers, Hume, Locke, and Berkeley, thought that. Hume didn't believe in God. Berkeley was a bishop, and Locke certainly was a believer of God. But they thought that what we start our knowledge with is perceptions of the world, that is, mental events. So, and then we build up a picture of the scientific world. So, in fact, mind consciousness comes first, and we build up a theory that there is a physical world and that there are atoms and quarks and all sorts of things. But those are theories, really. Right? When you talk about quarks, you're talking about things that cannot be observed. And when scientists talk these days about other universes, you can't observe those. These are theories. So consciousness is not a theory, it's an obvious fact that we are conscious. And it's consciousness which constructs theories about the objective world. So my point here is simple. Most philosophers have believed that consciousness is better known than matter, and that it is probably the origin of matter. They haven't all believed in God, but they've all believed that conscious perceptions and feelings and thoughts are more real, more obviously, more unquestionable than theories about the objective physical universe are. This in philosophy is in general called idealism. I'm certainly an idealist, and I think most philosophers have been, that they might not use that word, and I think it's increasing. And panpsychism is one part, is one variety of idealism. So
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to ask you your opinion about Dennett's view. He passed away recently, and he obviously believed consciousness to be an illusion. And there are some other philosophers who are subscribing to the view of illusionism. So, what would your response be to that kind of thinking?
well, I find it hard even to think it's plausible, because you'd have to say that when you have a feeling of pain, for example, that feeling of pain doesn't exist, really. Or it is the firing of neurons in the brain, which seems to you to be pain, but it's not really. That's what it is. That's all it is, the firing of neurons in the brain. Well, I can't even see why anybody could possibly believe that, because pain is more real to me than the knowledge that I have neurons firing in my brain. I mean, one of them is very theoretical. It's a good theory, of course, but pain is not identical with it. It's not the same thing as neurons in my brain firing. And that seems to me an evident truth.
Yeah.
So I can't see how people like Dan Dennett even get started. They just have to have a dogma, an absolute dogma, that conscious feelings and thoughts and pains and pleasures are nothing but the firing of physical elements in the brain. And okay, they can say that, but it just looks obviously false. And the only truth about that is that when you feel pain, there are neuron events going on in the brain. And that's true, but that's a correlation. It's one thing goes along with another. They're not the same thing. So I just think here's an argument about your ultimate axiom. do you ultimately think there are nothing but quarks and atoms and nothing else? Or do you think there are pains and feelings and thoughts and all the richness of conscious life? And if you do think that, you're not a materialist anymore.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think this takes us to your starting point, your epistemology, because a lot of people don't realize, because they're affected by the popular culture of scientism, that you have to start off with certain metaphysical axioms, whether you're an idealist or you're a materialist, or whatever you're even going to be studying, you're going to be having some assumptions. So, for example, when I hear things like, well, neuroscientists have explained consciousness, the mind is simply the brain at work. Well, there's physicalist assumptions there. So,
Is it?
yeah, a lot of the times the background assumptions are just taken to be for granted or just brute facts.
I know. Well, Daniel Dennett is probably the best known materialist and influenced Dawkins quite a lot. He wrote a book called Consciousness Explained, but most philosophers call that book Consciousness Ignored.
Explained away.
Explained away. Yeah.
Absolutely. So now we'll get to another, I guess, hot topic, which is morality. So this is obviously something which he takes great pride in terms of, religion is evil because of X, Y, Z. And one of the things which I found really interesting is in the discussion between Lennox and Dawkins, Lennox brought him to his own earlier publication, River Out of Eden, in which he said the universe neither has no good or evil and nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And he said, how do you marry that with all these moral statements that you're actually making? And what was interesting as well is Lennox asked him, well, you're asking us to rebel against our genes, but what is it that rebels? If we are, for example, genes created as mind and body, then he's not a dualist. There's nothing else that he believes in. What are your thoughts about these types of rebuttals and these types of challenges from a moral perspective?
Yes. I think this is one of the great weaknesses of materialism, that there's no place for morality, really. I'll put it personally, I have been an atheist. When I was a young philosopher, I followed the popular trend among philosophers, and I was an atheist. But what changed my mind really was the thought. I was young, I was looking for a job, so what should I do in life? And I thought, well, I should make a lot of money really, because there's no reason I shouldn't. There's, people talk about morality, but that's just what they happen to like. I'm going to go and make money. And then I thought, no, there's something wrong with that. So what was wrong with it? Nothing scientifically wrong with it. Making a lot of money. No, science doesn't say they don't do that. So what says don't do that? And so I thought morality is a part of the universe. Instead, there's something which makes me feel obliged to do something that, for example, might help other people. Is that just a bit of a material splurge in my brain? And I couldn't think that. So that was the beginning of my turn from atheism. And I felt a moral obligation. Where are moral obligations? Where are they? Well, in my brain? No, they're not in my brain. They're not anywhere. So that's already sort of pointing in a God-led direction, because it's saying there's more to the universe than just material particles bumping into each other. There's a moral sort of pressure And where could that be? It's not in time and space. It's not scientific. So you're saying there's something beyond the material. And for me, that was the beginning of saying work towards idealism. Yes.
Yeah. You've obviously interacted with Dawkins, and I felt that in the God Delusion, when he's often complaining about theologians, I had a feeling he's actually speaking about you. Probably due to a lot of interactions you've had. So I wanted your thoughts on his reply to morality, and just to get your perspective on it. So in the God Delusion, he gives a evolutionary explanation in terms of natural selection, social cohesion, kin selection, and all of these things. However, I wanted to put a question to you based upon the works of Alex Rosenberg. So Alex Rosenberg, in an Atheist Guide to Reality, he essentially argues that we have a core morality which evolution has given us, right? So all over the world, we have these universal moral norms. However, he says we can't say that natural selection chose the right core morality. There's no link between us evolving core morality and morality being true. So his view is that we should accept, as atheists, because he's written this book for atheists, that we have to be moral nihilists. Now, he's not saying that means we're going to be evil people, but he's just saying that atheism leads to moral nihilism. Would you go that far?
Yes, I would. Because I've faced that possibility myself. And I could have been a moral nihilist. And nothing I ever knew about evolution told me I couldn't be, because I'd evolved that way. I'd evolved to think self-preservation and the destruction of your enemies and having as many children as possible. These are all evolutionarily preferable options, right? So if you talk about a universal morality and you look at the course of evolution, which was called by Herbert Spencer, the philosopher, the survival of the fittest, then what do you do about that? You say, well, morality, I believe, is the survival of the fittest. So if I'm sensible, would I try to be the fittest that I can? And then you have the question, what do you mean by fit? What is the fittest? Well, science doesn't tell you that. The fittest is just what happens to survive. And that's probably killing all your enemies. Right? So an evolutionist is not only, if consistent, not only a nihilist, he's actually a terrorist, because he'd think, well, the survival of the fittest is the story of evolution, so I'm going to exterminate everybody who disagrees with me. And I think that's grossly immoral. But why do I think that? Morality has a greater force than some state of some brain. And just let me put it in a sentence. In a purely material world, there are no values.
Yes.
And that concept of value is what you need to put into the universe to have a belief in God, who would be the supreme value, something worth aiming at just for its own sake. And that I do not think such a view is actually supported by a purely material survival of the fittest story about human beings.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I think people misunderstand when philosophers like yourself make these points is This is not to say that an individual atheist cannot be a reasonable moral person. They can. But it's talking about the metaphysical background that a person may hold. It may be contrary to the way that people actually behave. Now, your book, interestingly, is titled "Why There Almost Certainly Is a God," and that obviously is a parallel to what Dawkins has as a conclusion. There almost certainly isn't a God. So this is a diametrically opposite to that. So what I found interesting about the title is that philosophers usually do not like to speak about God except in a very probabilistic way. So even if they're going to be open to it, they're not going to use terms like certainty. And even if in their private lives they do believe, they'll still be cautious. But you came out with that title. And do you think that one of the reasons why you did that is to show, well, the evidence and the arguments overall from a probabilistic view are far greater than 50% from a purely philosophical perspective? When you line up consciousness, when you line up the first cause, when you line up morality, when you line up contingency and the beginning of the universe, all these things, when you put them together with the design arguments, then the cumulative case for theism is far stronger, rather than just a faith-based case.
That's very well stated. I think you're right. That's true. But what are you saying? I should perhaps be more certain than that.
No. What I was saying was, I was delighted to see a title like that, because I think what's happened is, because the trend amongst philosophers, like you said in your time as well, was to be quite atheistic, then it's quite refreshing to see a philosopher take the opposite stance. And it gives younger philosophers and younger academics more confidence that actually we can state these bold positions and we can argue for them.
Yes, I think that's true. What people like Dawkins mix up is looking at actual religious believers and the way they behave and not liking it. And they mix that up with philosophical theories about the nature of reality. And of course, people like me can talk about the nature of reality being supreme value and love and beauty and truth. Yes, and we believe that. But look at the way we live, and you might think, well, they don't live like that, do they? So I think that's what they mix up. You say, yeah, but part of course, a religious view is that we are all falling short of the value and ideal of the universe. So there is something wrong with human life, and that's part of our theory. And so you wouldn't expect us to be perfect. But they mix up and they say, look at these horrible things that happen. It's true, they do. But what believers in God have to say is, well, they're simply not living up to their own theories. And maybe we're all a bit like that.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things which I think he doesn't realize, that if he is to use an argument like that and someone was to change the variables and input, instead of Christianity or Islam or Judaism, if someone was to put, communism or what was happening during the French secular revolution, then, the state atheism of those eras were eras of, mass killing, suppression of freedom of speech. Some estimates go into close to 100 million. The number of people that were killed under state atheist repression. So, they also claim to be secular humanists who believe in liberalism and these values, and obviously they don't live up to them. But the difference between, I think, theists and atheists of that era is, at least we have a standard, a moral standard from which we can say we've fallen. But when it comes to, say, Stalin applying, Darwinism at a social class level, there's no standard to say that what he said is, what he did is wrong according to his own worldview.
Yes, I think that's entirely true. Yeah, and In fact, I do think that even though we all fall short of our standards, if we have a very widespread view that there are no standards, things will be even worse.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the last thing I'd like to put to you, and this is something I put to most of my guests, is what are you currently working on? Any book, any paper? Is there any
Well,
particular project?
I've written quite a lot of books already, and my last one, at my age, it's time I wrote a last one, is coming out from Cambridge University Press this year. Um, uh, but what I've been doing recently, I've done a lot about God, but I am actually a minister of a Christian church, the Church of England. So I've tried to look at that in particular and show how it can be more obviously consistent with scientific beliefs, and how it can be morally positive. So I've done that, but it's probably not of great general interest, I'm afraid. I am an academic, after all. But so it's about a theologian called Karl Barth, who's a Christian theologian. And I think I'm ending my life with an argument, I'm afraid. I think he's been wrong about his presentation of Christianity, which is this is the only revelation from God. Everything else is false. That's
Right,
in a nutshell.
right,
So I'm arguing against this and saying the Christian view ought to be that many religions are paths to God, and God will, in fact, God desires the unity with all human beings and doesn't limit it to one sect of one religion. It's, I think, if I may dare say so, it's rather like some Sufi views of religion, but it's held by a lot of Christians. Anyway, that's the book.
right.
So it's called Karl Barth on Religion, a Critique. So you asked what I was doing, and that's what
Brilliant.
I'm yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So just one last thing I'd like to add to that. When I first came across your book many, many years ago, in the early days of, the responses to new atheism, I actually told an Islamic scholar about this from Saudi Arabia who was residing in Mecca, which is the holy city. And I'm pleased to say that he not only bought your book, he actually took it back to Saudi. And back then, Saudi was very strict in terms of foreign literature to enter the country. So things like books on philosophy and things which maybe seemed heretical, even if it's an argument for the existence. It's a book refuting atheism. It might be misunderstood by the customs people or someone else as literature which is heretical. But either way, he went back and he actually was studying your work. So I just like to highlight that to show that you were very influential in Islamic circles as well.
Oh, well, I'm delighted to hear it because I think one of our major aims in my academic life has been to decrease the amount of misunderstanding between religious faiths, and even within religious faiths where people seem to dislike each other quite a lot, and to try just to support the view that really love and understanding and truth, these are the things we're all really as believers trying to seek and support. So I'm delighted to hear that.
Thank you so much, Professor. It's been a great pleasure. I'd love to have you on in the future again. And thank you for giving us your time.
Okay, that's a pleasure.
Cheers. Bye bye.
Right.